Shanel Lindsay is an attorney, entrepreneur, and cannabis advocate. She is the founder and president of Ardent LLC, a Boston-based biotech company that develops safe, effective, and convenient products for the cannabis industry. A drafter Massachusetts adult use cannabis law, founding member and co-chair of the Northeast Cannabis Coalition, Massachusetts Patients Advocacy Alliance advisory board member, and well-known advocate for cannabis legislation on the East Coast and beyond, Shanel has a dedication to improving public understanding of cannabis's benefits and eliminating the stigma surrounding its use.
Today we have Shanel Lindsay, and she is someone that I admire partly because she's one of the first people I've met coming into the industry, and that was almost 4 years ago. So as the co-founder or the founder of Ardent and Eon, and also part of the CCC's advisory board, just super excited to have Shanel Lindsay with us today. How are you, Shanel?
I'm doing great, Ulysses, and thank you. And of course, I remember our first meeting, and it's funny, I was going to say the student has become the teacher, right? Yeah. For over 4 years ago now, when I was teaching at Northeastern Institute of Cannabis, and boy, the industry has changed a lot over these last 5 years, but I'm very excited to be here, being able to talk to the Clark community about all things cannabis. So for me, you know, I've been using cannabis for over 20 years now, and it started when I was a teenager, but really started being a medical use for me after my son was born. And my son is almost 20 years old. Can you believe that? He's going to be 20 next year in
Can't believe it.
Upcoming February. And I started using cannabis to treat an ovarian cyst that I got after my son was born. And so I was using suppositories and lotions and other things that I was making in order to treat my pain and inflammation, avoid pharmaceuticals. A very typical story, right? When you think about cannabis and how it becomes important in someone's life. And for me, there was always this tension that existed between my life and my cannabis use that became a central theme in my life, right? And it started out with just the hypocrisy that existed, you know, when I was in college and other people were drinking and, you know, doing, you know, very irresponsible things. And yet me, as somebody who was just a cannabis consumer, was seen as, you know, just crazy and outside of the box and something that was to be avoided, right? And it started out as a minor annoyance, right, in life, but it really became a real detriment or opportunity for me to really lose everything once I became an attorney. So I became an attorney. I worked as a civil defense lawyer for a mid-sized law firm, Sugarman Rogers, Barshak and Cohen in the North End. And, you know, I really enjoyed that career. It was something that I worked very hard at. You know, I had my son when I was in college. And so I had him in law school, and that was a very difficult process, right? Becoming a lawyer was something I was very proud of, and I was making a great career for myself in the law. It wasn't, I would say, I didn't love every aspect of it, but I definitely, looking back, see how important becoming a lawyer was. But I, again, worked really hard for this, and it was something that was, you know, what I thought was going to be part of me building wealth for myself and my family. And really one day when I was driving to work, all of that, you know, really hung in the balance, was almost destroyed by me being pulled over for taking a right on a red. So, you know, in Massachusetts, we're allowed to take a right on red, but not if there's a sign. And so I wasn't paying attention, and I must not have seen the sign, and I took a right on red and got pulled over. So thinking, you know, maybe I'll get a ticket or something, I wasn't too worried, but the officer came over and saw some cannabis that was in my bag. And instead of giving me a ticket, which should have happened, right? Because this was 2009, decriminalization had passed in 2008. And so anybody who had less than an ounce of cannabis was supposed to get a ticket. But when this officer saw the cannabis, he immediately ordered me out of the car, started searching my car over my protests, and then pulled out the cannabis and arrested me. Threw cuffs on me, put me in the back of the police car, and I watched as my car got impounded, as I'm crying and asking him and pleading, why is he arresting me? Because this should be a ticket. And so, long story short, he brings me down to the police station, and I begin to, you know, kind of think of whatever legal argument I can think of to get out of this and tell him that he's violating my civil rights, because and at this point I'm terrified because they're telling me that they're bringing me down to the courthouse to get arraigned, and this is the same courthouse that I represent clients in.
Right.
So you can see, where everything was really about to fall apart, all over me having a decriminalized amount of cannabis. And so I was able to argue with them and get them to weigh it and release me. But from that moment on, it really stuck with me that if I had not been legally trained to make that argument, that I would have ended up arrested with a record and lost my job. And so that was something that was a turning point for me, understanding and realizing at that point that legalization doesn't just naturally happen with a focus on equity, right? And that decriminalization is not legalization. And in fact, it only protects the same people that are protected under discretion of the police, right? Which is not people of color, which is not anybody that the police don't like, right? And it's really not a safe harbor for anyone. And so for me, my legal career continued at that point. But again, like I mentioned, the hypocrisy of cannabis use versus anything else, and the fact that it could and did put everything that I worked for in jeopardy really made an impression on me. And when I did have the opportunity to make the leap from the legal world into the cannabis world, and I would say that it wasn't a full leap, it was more of a straddle, right? Because at that point, I went and I was recruited by the Lottery Commission, and I went and I worked for the Mass State Lottery, and I was their employment counsel and director of human resources. But again, I always had my eye on going and starting up my own business. When I was in college, I imported handbags and I sold them on eBay. I was always kind of part of the hustle and trying to do something that allowed me to kind of be and live my life the way that I wanted, and not necessarily be, part of the corporate world. I think that when I started and became an attorney, I had these fantasies of being this high-powered corporate lawyer and wearing all these suits and stuff. And then I was like there walking the halls wearing the suits and thinking like, I don't want to be in this office all day writing a brief all day. I really wanted to do something that, was part of my passion. I used to watch and read articles and see people that found their passion and thought, how can I find that? And if you asked me what I was really passionate about, I would say cannabis. I would never think that would ever be a thing. And I tell people that all the time. What are you passionate about? And don't think that the thing that you're going to say, it could be the craziest thing that you would think no one could ever make money on. But if you are passionate about it, you can act, there's money flowing around that, whatever you're thinking of. And so same thing with cannabis, but I knew there was money around cannabis, but not necessarily a legal pathway to make that happen. And after decriminalization, when medical marijuana was on the horizon, that again piqued my interest as far as, okay, this is something I really need to get involved in. And when I saw the medical law get translated into regulations, and was really keen and watching exactly what was happening there, that was, I think, when I saw again. So the first time I saw that legalization does not play out the way you expect it was with decriminalization. Okay. And the second time that I learned that was when the medical marijuana law was translated into regulations and completely stripped the law of any and every intent that the cannabis community had when it was pushing for the law. And so that was a real introduction for me. And again, an opportunity for me as an attorney to say, hey, I'm able to see something happening here that I understand in a way and could potentially influence because I have this understanding and knowledge and could help to try to make it different and better. And, that's what happened with adult use. And so I think that that was a pretty long-winded introduction about the political side of things, just quickly on the company side of things. So at the same time as this like political stuff is happening, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, kind of the push to write the ballot initiative for adult use. And that was really kind of when I was, thrust fully into, cannabis law and policy and politics, on a pretty like full-time basis. But at the same time, I was also using my experience of having this ovarian cyst, making all these cannabis products, and having a very difficult time, like anybody who was doing it at the time, having a really difficult time making those products because there was no real understanding of the science around it and how to effectively make those products at home with very little product. And so I was developing, you can see it in the background there, a decarboxylator, and I have one here as well. So I went and I developed this machine and brought this machine to market. And essentially it's like a little lab grade heater that allows cannabis to heat it up to the exact right temperature in a very even way. There's like an algorithm and a heater that goes all around. And basically it is a companion to anybody who is using cannabis that allows them the ability to make any product that they would see on a dispensary shelf. And so that's really the other half of me in cannabis, a business owner, CEO, inventor, bringing products to market to help remove the stigma around cannabis. Like that was the main reason that I developed this, right? So people, I remember, so that people could not say, cannabis, you have no idea what the milligrams are. You know, we heard a lot of that, especially like when medical marijuana was coming to Massachusetts. Well, it's not a real medicine because you can't quantify how much it is in there because people are, you know, smoking it and you don't know. Well, actually that's not true. You can know exactly how much THC or CBD, you can optimize it, you can weigh it out, you can know and control your dose. And so that was a big part of removing the stigma around it and also giving people a very easy pathway to be able to make their medicine, because what I saw, especially when medical marijuana came to Massachusetts, it's like a light switch, right? If something's illegal, people stay away from it. The minute it becomes legal, people are drawn to it, right? Because there's not a fear of being, you know, arrested over it, or there's this idea that it's okay at this point. But you have all of these people, and you know, in Massachusetts, we legalized in 2012 and didn't have any dispensaries come online for 3 years. So you had people that had all this access to cannabis, didn't know how to use it, were burning it all up and thinking that it didn't work for them. And so again, being able to remove the stigma around this is something hard, this is something that doesn't work for people, and be able to make, again, a really simple, easy, and fun way for them to do it. And so at this point, my life, I would say, is 100% cannabis, between the political stuff and then growing this business over the last 5+ years.
That's great. That's super awesome. So just and I last time we had spoke, and thank you for that great introduction. You know, we're just kind of going on like, well, you know, what are some good topics to discuss? And me, I'm in the industry as well, but I don't know. I know what I know. The political and the law stuff is kind of difficult for me. So like, how do states get legal cannabis? Right now we have 33 plus states. How does that happen? I understand it's like 2 different ways. So
yeah, 2 different ways. And also there's like a very common pathway for legalization, right? It almost always starts off as decriminalization first,
right,
and then moves to medical, and then moves to adult use.
right.
And there may have been a few states that jumped in and did something medical before they decriminalized, especially when you started to see like CBD only laws come up.
Right.
And that kind of threw a wrench in things, right? Because there were some states that went and tried to like pass some CBD only laws really quickly. But in addition to just kind of that normal pathway of decriminalization, medical, and adult, and it makes sense, right? Like people get used to the idea, they see that the sky isn't falling, they actually see that it's good and it's positive, and then they're ready for adult use. And when a legalization campaign comes to town, so to speak, it can be 2 different ways. And primarily it's been a ballot initiative. So ballot initiative is one way, and the other way is the traditional ways that laws are made, which is the legislature taking it up and just making a law, right? A lot of times people don't really think about, you know, how laws are made, and it's funny because before, you know, I was an attorney, but I was very, very much in the private sector, and, you know, was not very political before I went into the cannabis industry, which is funny now, right? Because I'm like really involved, but very jaded when it comes to politics, but definitely still very involved. But that's usually, people don't usually necessarily think about kind of how laws come to be, other than watching like Schoolhouse Rock when you're younger, unless you're in political science. You just kind of, the laws come, you hear about them, but that's usually legislative action. In marijuana law, no legislature ever wanted to touch the idea of cannabis, right? Despite the fact that there started to be, you know, an overwhelming support for cannabis. Like in Massachusetts, there are groups like organizations that would go around, MassCan in the beginning, to go and NORML, to go and take surveys of how people are feeling about a particular political topic, right? And in Massachusetts, it had been trending positive on cannabis for like, you know, a very long time, since like the 80s and 90s, but no political actor is going to put all of their, you know, political capital on the line to cape for cannabis, right? Like it's just not going to happen. And so what ends up happening is most states, and not all states, so here's a great example. Rhode Island does not have a ballot initiative process, right? So it all comes down to state by state about whether or not this ballot initiative process is an alternative to making a law than a legislature. And in Massachusetts it is. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because the people, if we're living in a democracy and the people decide that they want something, but the legislature won't act, shouldn't the people be able to come together as a group and say, we would like to put this forward to the people to vote on to make this a law? And that's exactly what a ballot initiative process is. And in Massachusetts, it requires 12 or 14 people, citizens of Massachusetts, to get together and to write something and submit it. And there's a whole process that gets submitted to the Attorney General's office and it gets kicked back. That is important though, right? The fact that a ballot initiative by nature is much more limited than what the legislature can do, right? And that becomes important because in cannabis law in Massachusetts, all of these, whether medical, decrim, and adult use were all achieved through ballot initiative, right? So that means you have a group of private citizens that are writing something that will eventually come law. Like nothing could go wrong, right? You know, you see, it becomes, you know, a legislature is much more equipped to write a law because they are not, here's some good examples. In ballot initiative, you can't undo a judicial action, right? So there are all these rules about what you can and can't do if you're putting a ballot initiative forward.
What is a judicial action?
So a judicial action is a court ruling, right? So the practical thing that meant when we were writing the ballot initiative for adult use, we couldn't include expungement because expungement is undoing a court order, right? If somebody was convicted, that's vacating it. So we couldn't do that. So you can see that even when you start with a ballot initiative, you're already starting a little bit with your hands tied about what you can do and what you can do, right? And it's still left on the legislature, and we just actually passed expungement, I think, last year. And so again, there's still follow-on and work that needs to be done with a ballot initiative that doesn't need to be done when the legislature does it, you know, or it's much easier to tweak. So ballot initiative, like I said, because the legislatures will not take these things up, ballot initiative has been the primary way that legalization has come forward in all across the US. I believe it was only Vermont who just had the legislature go last year or the year before and legalize cannabis. So you're starting to see some appetite for the legislature to do it. The legislature in the tri-state area, so New York, New Jersey, they are going to be legalizing through the legislature. And you can see that, like, the legislature has said they've taken it up. I mean, New York was very, very close to legalizing a year and a half ago, and it fell through because they didn't have the equity, you know, provisions that they needed in there. So yes, you see now, and that kind of is what happens. Like, there's a domino effect, right? People see, or the states see, that everyone around them has legalized, and now the legislature in those states have taken it up and said, okay, we're going to get ahead of this and we're going to get involved. So I think you're going to see more of that. More of the legislatures getting involved, especially in the Northeast, like where it's already happening. I think in places where cannabis is still very stigmatized, you're going to see ballot initiatives come into play. But like I mentioned, Rhode Island, poor little Rhode Island, they have been working so hard to try to get legalization for so long, and they just keep banging their heads against the wall because the legislature just isn't moving, and they have no other options because their constitution for their state does not allow for ballot initiatives. So that's kind of the initial framework that people need to understand. And in Massachusetts, we did move forward with a ballot initiative. We learned a lot, right, based on the medical law. And just going back a little bit, what happened with the medical was that it was a 4-page ballot initiative, very general, didn't really have too many specifics in it, but had the core important things, like there should be caregivers and there should be dispensaries and other things like that. Well, when the Department of Public Health took that over, they actually created a system that only allowed one caregiver to one patient, which basically blew and completely stomped out any opportunity for caregivers to be part of the marketplace in Massachusetts, which was very unfortunate. And then they also made it $500,000 to even in the bank to even apply, and $30,000 to apply. So I think it just, that's 2 of like 25 things that they did in order to make it a very, very corporate system that was biased to large out of state, well-funded, non-diverse businesses. And really that's what set the stage and framework, sadly, in Massachusetts for the regulated cannabis industry.
And that's a loaded. I appreciate that, especially the Rhode Island look on things. And I don't know if you know Jessica Gonzalez. She's part of this class as well. Kind of put us on game a bit with the medical, because when you had mentioned the ballot initiative in New Jersey, they didn't decrim there. It's just medical, and they still have criminalization of it, which is an interesting dynamic. So was that through a ballot initiative as well, just to go directly to medical market?
Yeah, I'm not as on top of exactly what happened in New Jersey, but I'm pretty sure that it was some legislative action. I remember Christie holding everything up, and then when he was gone, there was like some movement. So I think that's what happened, but don't quote me on that. And Justice Awesome, she's actually my trademark counsel, so we're close with her. And yeah, really important to make sure as you're building your business, you're covered on all different fronts. And so yeah, happy to say that we actually just got some marks approved recently. So
dope. So how does one, and you were involved with the adult use ballot initiative. How does one get involved with writing a ballot initiative?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting convergence of events, right, to make that happen. And like I mentioned, people say, oh, do you think it's important that you were a lawyer? I would say that besides, my passion and desire to create products and, cannabis, I would say being a lawyer is hands down the most, important piece of my success in this industry. And for me, like I mentioned, I started becoming very vocal about what was happening after the medical marijuana regulations came down, right? Because they completely cut out any equity. They said that people with prior cannabis convictions could not even work in the medical, like not even own. You couldn't even get a job, you know what I mean? And so it started, I realized, again, it was kind of like Groundhog Day, right? Like with decriminalization, it was like, okay, once again, I see that like this is just not going to happen the way that people are expecting it, even when it explicitly was supposed to happen that way, So, and at the same time, I was developing Ardent and the decarboxylator and working with the lab, and I just started to say like, okay, I need to start speaking up about this stuff, right? And then I was invited by Marijuana Policy Project, so they were the ones who were behind the ballot initiative. And I was invited by them to be an author on the ballot initiative. And again, I would not have ever been invited if I wasn't an attorney.
Absolutely.
And so, so I was invited, and at that point, it was really off to the races. There were about 20 drafters, I would say, of the ballot initiative. And this is everybody from dispensaries were involved, of course, because they're funding it. And that's something to always be, people fund ballot initiatives, right? It takes money to do it. And when that happens, the people that give the money obviously want to say in what's being written, right? And so I think that, you can even see vestiges of some of that stuff in the adult use, even though the great part was Shalene and I were both on the drafting committee. And so we definitely tag team and we're like, we need to make equity a priority here, And so we went and did that. We got consensus in the community. We started to try to get the first consensus with, like elected officials of color and things like that. And then this is early on when people are still kind of like, not really knowing how they feel about it, but we were able to really, and pull Northeastern Law School, that's where I went to law school in, and they have been a great help and support for us through all of this and taking us on as a client, essentially through their legal skills and social contact program. And so really, again, just putting the pressure on from all sides and saying like, listen, if this, like, we just had to basically come and say like, if you don't put equity in this ballot initiative, like, it's not going to pass.
Right.
Because people are not going to support it. And it really just comes down to that, like threats, you know what I mean? About like, this isn't going to happen because nobody wants to put equity in there, especially if it's big businesses that are funding this thing, But again, part of it was putting something together that we were going to be able to ask, and also that we were going to push to the community. Because I knew for me, if there wasn't a clear equity focus here, then that wasn't something that I was going to be interested in promoting either, So So we wrote the ballot initiative, got through that process, and then began the process of trying to get this thing passed, you know? So I was a spokesperson for the campaign and on Fox News and all these other places that people didn't want to see us, and talk about why this was, you know, this was good, why it was necessary, why, you know. And then it was interesting because during the campaign, the first strategy, right, was to do what they had done in Colorado, right? Because Massachusetts, only Colorado had legalized before us. So that was really the model people were looking at. In Colorado, the way that they got this was marijuana is safer than alcohol, or treat marijuana the same as alcohol, right? That is how it started out, because it's not as dangerous, and using that. Well, in Massachusetts, like, we actually weren't doing too great with that strategy, right? The idea, people were just like, no, alcohol is dangerous, so we shouldn't put something else on the market. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just like easy. And then you also had Mayor Marty Walsh, former alcoholic, you know, who was out there saying, you know, it wasn't a good look as far as like how it was unrolling, you know. And then equity really started to become the center, right? When we started talking about you know, the arrest rates in Massachusetts, and that started getting traction with people. And that's why we say now, hey, equity is the reason this got passed in Massachusetts, right? Because people really didn't care about this industry coming. People were against it. Massachusetts, as liberal it is, it's fake liberal, it's very Puritan, it's very, you know, it's very not in my backyard. And again, it was really, in my opinion, when we started focusing on the equity stuff, that really things started to get more solid as far as the ability of this campaign to win. And so, and we did that. We won at the same time Trump was elected. So that was like a bittersweet victory there. But again, that then pushed this ballot initiative after it passed, right? After all that hard work of the people, when the legislature won't do anything, guess what happens after a ballot initiative passes?
What?
The legislature has like 6 months to go and do whatever they want to it and change it. And so that was actually, that again, becoming more experienced on the political side about what happens here. I never knew that. Who would think that that would happen? But guess what? There were other people, other activists that had actually passed campaign reform. You never heard of it in Massachusetts. You don't want to know why? Because after the ballot initiative for campaign reform passed, the legislature tore it apart, and it never came to be. So some of those activists were our friends and came to us and said, hey guys, I know you're like really happy and proud that you got this passed and you got this equity provision in there, but like, make no mistake, when the legislature takes that up, they're going to try to take that out. And I would say that was the best advice that we ever got. And we went and we formed EON, which is Equitable Opportunities Now, nonprofit, and started to just build consensus around, hey, this law passed, now it's going to come into play. And it was a great lesson though, because again, it pushed me back to when the regulations came out, not just but that process of the regulations coming out for the medical. So it wasn't at the regulation stage yet, but knowing that the legislature had another bite at the apple. And what do you know, when they went and tried to change the House bill, completely took out our equity provision.
Wow.
And so that was but that being said, we were prepared and we're able to pull the lever, and the community come together, and, you know, the elected officials, and demanding more equity. And that push is what led to all of the different equity provisions that are in the final law. And so it really was a kind of, you know, a predictable process, and it really showed me how important organizing is, right? Because you can't, when something happens, you can't just be organizing right then. You have to already have people ready to know that there's going to be some, you know, nonsense happening. They're going to need to come back against, and you have to be really prepared for that and be ready to lobby for yourself. And so that that I would say has been the main focus of the last 5 years or 4 years in this implementation, is how do we actually make those equity provisions come to life and have real meaning, especially as we're trying to roll out these equity provisions. There's still this huge, you know, elephant in the room, which is how biased the medical system program was, and that really forms the basis for everything. And so again, I've learned a lot of lessons about how aggressive that you need to be, that what we did in Massachusetts was not aggressive enough. That from the outset, you have to do things like exclusivity, and you can't just wait and think that, you know, huge players that have, you know, years and years of experience endless amounts of money are going to, you know, make way for smaller operators. Like it's never going to happen, you know, and you need to be aggressive. So that's what I tell other states, that, you know, be very wary of the fact that equity is incredibly elusive. And if you want even a little bit of it, you have to go in, you know, swinging really hard.
You had mentioned that once social equity became a topic of conversation, then you started to make some headway with the ballot initiative. So how was that, I guess, and I almost know the answer to this, on the medical side, what gave them that push? Was it the talk of patients rather than, like, you know, just the general population?
Well, I think that what started to happen was, you know, people were saying, or, you know, in Massachusetts, there are a lot of people that never encounter people of color, right? They're living in these, you know, affluent areas, and for them, no one's getting arrested, right? And it needed to be kind of like shoved in people's faces of like, no, this is happening. It's happening very often. And at the very least, we should be legalizing in order to get rid of those, you know, that disparity. There was also another argument on the patient side that, you know, not everybody has all this money to become a medical marijuana patient. And especially when you're talking about people on public assistance and other things like that, they're putting themselves at risk by being on some roster that they use cannabis, right? Especially with all the federal prohibitions. And so that was also kind of another, you know, push there. The problem was that even if you're putting equity provisions out there, what you're not realizing is the pie essentially has already been divided up, because when you're looking at cannabis and the cannabis industry, it's all a property game. I say that all the time. The cannabis industry is completely a property game, because the way that it's set up is, even if there are not limits on how many a town is going to allow to come into the state, there are absolutely limits by just the geography of how many businesses can be in a certain area, because they have to be separated in buffer zones, right? So when you look at the medical marijuana industry, all of those dispensaries went and snatched up all the properties, you know? So you're looking at very, very, very few spaces that are even available for equity entrepreneurs to come in. And then you're also, at the same time, when you look at our law, yes, there are equity provisions, but yes, there are also still provisions benefiting, you know, dispensaries. Look at it, there's priority for equity and a priority for dispensaries, and they go back and forth, right? That isn't prioritizing equity, right? And again, some of that stuff we couldn't get around because that was in the original ballot initiative. And so I think that that dispensaries that are already up and running, that we're going to have priority. And so it is very interesting how these things get teased out in the regulations, right? Because they can either be read very broadly or they can be read very narrowly. And unfortunately, the Cannabis Control Commission decided to read some of those benefits for the dispensaries very broadly. And again, that impacted it. So it's not just about getting the equity provisions on there. It's about making sure that when they are rolling out, that you're being very aggressive about creating a space for equity, because we find that these businesses that are already here are incredibly aggressive, right? Like they don't want to share the space. And so, and it's not going to happen unless there's a real carve out made. And there's certainly a legitimate state interest. There's an overwhelming interest, right? Are we not tired of, you know, disproportionate impact? Are we not tired of racism? Are we not tired of people of color not having any opportunities whatsoever, despite, you know, working just as hard and, you know, honestly having all of the negative impact on our community? So I think that, you know, those are the things that need balance there. I think the challenge is, right, like, just to play devil's advocate, the challenge is that this industry, the way that it was rolled out, was very difficult for any operator. Right? It's very regulated as far as compliance. I mean, I know operators that are on the medical side that have been in business for years that still haven't made a dime, right? So it's the challenge is compounded by the fact that prices are incredibly high. We have a thriving, you know, illicit marketplace because very much because the regulations are way too stringent, even on any other operator. So it really kind of adds insult to injury, because you have these medical operators that feel like they're being slighted because they're not making any money. And then you have equity people who absolutely deserve a place in the, and deserve the first place in the market. So it really becomes like, a really messy stew of not really the best policies being in place. And again, you can look at that in Massachusetts, like look at, and firsthand, look at the restrictions and the cost that it takes to run this kind of business, and see that, again, there's like a raging industry that is just, unregulated. And that's where the majority of the money is going at this point.
Right. So do you think, and kind of talking about the issues that the medical operators have, seeing that it's extremely regulated, obviously when we talk about decriminalization, we're not talking about operating at that point. It's just really a shift in policy. But does it make sense for a state, or even maybe consider the federal government, to say, hey, let's skip decriminalization, let's skip medical, and just go directly to a adult consumer market? Do you feel like that's a good time to have more of an equity conversation?
100%. I think we should absolutely make that leap to a full regulated market, but only if equity is involved. And yes, I think that would help to regulate things. Obviously, people could still focus and do medical, but it would be much easier for folks to, and you could have a separate medical that doesn't have taxes and other things like that. But absolutely, I mean, legalization needs to happen now. There are still people every day that are being arrested and thrown into prison for very small amounts of cannabis. And that is just, and not just that, losing their opportunities at schooling, and like all the things that are important in order to become an adult and build a life for yourself. And when that is taken away because of cannabis, that is something that really ruins not just that person's life, but everybody who's involved in that person's life, especially if they have children or a partner or whatever, that is, again, I think that you've seen our communities torn apart by this type of over policing, and yeah, that damage needs to stop as soon as we possibly can.
So just on the federal level, are we going to see a more traditional kind of same wave with them, like meaning, hey, we'll start with decriminalization, then we'll accept more medical across states, and then adult?
I think this conversation has heated up so long, and they have just sat on it for so long and not made any, like, the time for decriminalization is like 10 years ago. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's talking about that anymore. Like, it's either you're legalizing it or not. You know what I mean? I think that decriminalization put up now is like, yeah, like, what are you in the Stone Ages? Like, that's not a progressive policy. Progressive policy is legalization with an equitable component. And you've seen that. I mean, you've already seen full legalization in multiple bills that are still, somewhat alive or pending or whatever the case may be. And again, I'm only in favor of it if equity is involved, because if not, it is just going to be transformed into any other. I mean, talk about an industry where the suits can just fly in and just, do whatever they want. We've seen that. And then we've also seen the result of that, right? Like MedMen, like what I can name so many different ones. It's like, you can't just come in and try to fake the funk in this industry. It's just going to fall apart. And I don't want to see that happen on a national level, like this huge ballooning and falling. And it's like, no, it should just be done the right way. There should be an equity component about it. And then there should definitely be, cottage industry aspect to it. I think there's will the federal government get it right? Hell no, but I think that there would be a way to do it correctly. Do I think that will ever happen? No, but I'm curious to see what will happen.
So, and this is I'm sure you get this question, like, when is it going to happen? I feel like it's been 5 years for the past.
I know, it's so funny. So I had access to a lot of old cannabis publications. I'm talking about cannabis journals from back in like the early and mid 60s.
Absolutely.
Right? And, talking about cannabis, this is when, they first started doing testing at University of Mississippi and things like that. And can I tell you that I read those and all of them say, legalization is absolutely going to happen within 5 years. That's what it says, these things, right? And I'm laughing because I would say probably about, 4 years ago now, or there was this big talk, like probably like halfway into Trump's presidency. There was like, remember, all these acts were up and everybody's like, legalization is gonna happen, and I thought it's gonna happen in a month or in a year, and I sat there and all I thought was what I read in that old thing. And I even told people, because they were like, no, it's definitely happening this session, and there were so many articles about it, and I said, I'll believe it when I see it, because I really didn't think it was going to happen, and it didn't. So I'm going to just stay with that, because it always seems so close. And I do think cannabis is something that like politicians definitely like hold out, and it like becomes like a token, a talking point, and then it just like fizzles away when other like more important things come up. And so I'm curious to see what will happen with this election cycle, but I still think we're just getting such lukewarm, answers on it all that I don't know. I just don't see anything happening anytime soon.
Right. No, I can agree with you. I love that, because wow, you'd have to share with me some of those publications. I'm really curious.
Yeah, I definitely will. It's really cool stuff. And again, they were convinced, right? Because look at all these wonderful properties that it has. And, and like here we are like 40 years later, still dealing with this. I mean, almost 60 at this point. So yeah, we'll see. But I think that the states have it right. It definitely is not rolling back. Like another question I get or people ask often is like, oh, well, do you think cannabis is rolling? Never. No.
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I will tell you, cannabis is like a Pandora's box. Once you open it, people are not going back because they're using it. It's helping them. And that's the beautiful thing about cannabis is it helps legalize itself. Like all of the terrible stigma, and I say this, we never would have gotten legalization here in Massachusetts if cannabis wasn't such a powerful tool, you know what I mean? Because people started seeing that on medical, you know what I mean? And then they started saying, well, wait a minute, how come everybody can't access a medical? And, that starts to be, and it's a great, slippery slopes are usually not great things, but for cannabis it is, because once you open that door and people start to see that, number one, it's not so bad, not that it's just not so bad, that it's actually great and so useful, that doesn't roll back, and people will march for that. They will fight for that. And we saw that, like, that's not going to happen. And I'm very confident about that. And in Massachusetts, like people would not let that stand, even the conversation of taking cannabis away at this point. So in my opinion, it's like a state by state, it's a battle, it's a process. I really think we need to be looking at the South, right? The South is set up just like Massachusetts was, even worse, all of these huge, large, producers coming from the agricultural side that have dominated and squashed out equity in all of those places, now coming into cannabis and making that happen under the guise of being progressive. So I think that is something that really needs to happen. I don't think you can think of any place in the United States, in the South, where people are more disenfranchised and marginalized and negatively impacted by racism and everything that comes along with the war on drugs. So I think it's really important for us to figure out what's happening down there before it's too late, if it already isn't.
Right. So going back to the comment you had made about some bills and possibly equity written in those bills at the federal level, do you feel like it's the responsibility of the federal government to help repair some of the harms of prohibition? So like, what are those equity words look like in bills?
Absolutely, 100%. It is it's got federal government's responsibility, and honestly, it's a failing that they haven't done that already. And not just with respect to cannabis, with respect to so many different things like federal sentencing guidelines and so many different things. Obviously, there's been progress on that, but there shouldn't need to be progress. There should just be changing in things that are wrong. But what that looks like is dedicated money going back. So that's something we're fighting for in Massachusetts, right? That fight just came to a head when in the last legislative session, where they went and dedicated money from cannabis to police training rather than the money to equity, right? And so
can you repeat that again?
So in Massachusetts, as part of the police reform bill, there was cannabis money allocated to police training.
It's already been done.
Yes. And so pointing the hypocrisy in that, because still cannabis money has not been dedicated to equity.
Right.
Even though in the law, right, in that beautiful ballot initiative and still made it into the law, was that, like 6 different enumerated categories. So of course, substance abuse. And I roll my eyes at that, not because substance abuse training isn't important, because it absolutely is, but the idea that cannabis is a gateway drug, you know, rather than something that actually helps people off opioids and other drugs is laughable. And so that is, you know, it's concerning that that's the first area, or one of the first enumerated areas. Public safety, and then down further in the list is restorative justice, social justice. And so money needs to be dedicated there. So on the federal level, it needs to be much more clear that that money is dedicated and should go to equity. I am a huge proponent of exclusivity. That has become I might as well like get it tattooed, exclusivity, because I feel like that is the only way that we are actually going to get see equity. And what I mean by exclusivity is a carve out of a certain license type for a certain period of time, or a certain, you know, it's done in different ways, but I like when it's a particular license type. For example, delivery in Massachusetts, because it allows for a segment, a really important segment of the economy to be only in the hands of equity applicants and owners. So you don't have all of that other push from the larger companies that is stomping out the competition, not allowing for competition. And so I think that for me, I think that that's really what it should look like, exclusivity on all different fronts. I mean, I'm ready to get like, you know, really aggressive with it, because I'll tell you something. Even if the federal government came and said that only equity people for the first 5 years could get any type of license, you still wouldn't see full equity in this industry, right? So I'm like, I'm tired of feeling like doing one little thing is gonna put this industry on its head. We've tried so many different things and have only got a tiny bit. So again, I think that exclusivity on a federal level with money going back into equity is really where it needs to be. Anything else is watered down, but hopefully we'll get at least something.
That's a great answer. Someone asked me that question recently, and I answered similarly. It's like, just get the federal government to focus on putting more money in equity. I mean, you know, I interviewed Shakia for this class as well.
Yeah.
And like, you know, the budget of $300,000 for 3 years. I mean, that's ridiculous.
And all the money's there, and it's not even like money has to come from other things. Like the cannabis industry, like it generates billions of dollars a year, and none of that money is getting taxed right now, and none of the money, you know, it's thankfully some of the money is still going in our community on the illicit side, right? And that's a sad thing to be happy about, right? We really need to make these legal pathways, otherwise we're just repeating history.
No, absolutely. So you had touched on the police a little bit, kind of with your introduction, your run-ins there, and then obviously the over-policing of these communities that need the restorative justice. So and you answered perfectly with the federal government. What's the job of the local police and the state police with repair?
To be better trained, you know, to understand their bias. I think that that's been the biggest challenge. You know what I mean? So I'm on the advisory board. I got appointed to the advisory board by the treasurer after you know, question 4 passed, right? And so I'm on this advisory board, and there's police officers on there. There's a police chief in particular. And, you know, over these couple of years, like you know, he's a nice guy, right? But one thing that I definitely see is that no one wants to feel that they are biased, right? And that's the challenge, because when you are part of a police force that has been enforcing laws that by their nature have had a disproportionate impact, and you don't want to admit that you and everybody on your force is biased because of that, then we've hit a challenge, you know, we hit a rock, right? And so I think that, you know, for me, obviously police need to be better trained and understand, and need to err more on the side of caution. I don't know, is that too much to ask of police, right? That I don't know if we're trying to necessarily change the natural function of a particular, you know, segment, and maybe what we need to do is kind of pull this out of the police purview, right, as much as we can. And so I do think law enforcement absolutely has an obligation, and I think in many places they have started to doing this, of turning their attention to really what they should be focusing on, right, which is violent crimes and you know, domestic violence and all these other things that they should be working and helping people on, and not necessarily you know, people when it comes to cannabis. So that being said, I think that they need to take on more training, not from cannabis money, but from from some of their, you know, tactical gear, or some of their riot gear for, you know, and not have that, and do some training and stuff instead. Definitely, I think it's up to law enforcement to to stay on top of on the laws. And I do think it's important that on the advisory board that there is a, you know, law enforcement component, but I don't think, like, for example, the guy that's on there is from Walpole, right? So he's a chief of one particular town. But I wonder how all of this is being translated across the state. So I really do think that it's a responsibility of law enforcement to get together on this. And again, I can't tell you, I know that they aren't doing it from a social justice perspective, that's for sure, you know what I mean? But to get together and understand, you know, these issues and to educate themselves, again, maybe that is asking way too much.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's perfect. I interviewed a DEA agent. He said the exact same thing. We need more training. Well, ex-DEA, I should say. But the last question for this portion here, what if we reversed it? Obviously, with all that's going on now with police, you know, it's just tough to, you know, wrap your head around it, but a lot of communities are talking about defunding or reallocating, you know, funds from police departments. You know, the first thing that comes to mind is, hey, why don't we reallocate some of those funds into, you know, cannabis, right? If you're a legal state or you have a community that's legalized, you know, why not look at it from that perspective? So what do you think would be a good, you know, approach in that? And we're speaking hypothetically. Of course, it's probably not going to happen like that, right? But like, what would you say if we took money from the police and put it into the, you know, cannabis realm? How would that best be suited? Or any recommendations on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's all about getting people technical skills, right? So, and if I was defunding the police, would I put it specifically in cannabis? Probably not. I probably would put it specifically into, you know, general training of all kinds for our community. Because I think that while cannabis is a fantastic vehicle, like not everybody wants to be in cannabis. I mean, people that love it and have a passion like us definitely should. But I think that, you know, what our community really needs is reparations for all the damage that has happened due to, you know, over enforcement of cannabis, right? And so I think that when it just comes down to schooling and training and job skills and support, all of those things, essentially everything that has been taken away from us, you know, it needs to be given back, right? So that means opportunities, right? Opportunities for work, opportunities for business, opportunities for wealth creation. That is, at the end of the day, you know, how, and there are plenty of organizations that are already doing that, right? So it wouldn't even be very difficult. It's not like recreating the wheel. It's taking and seeing the systems and the programs that are already working here and amplifying those rather than, you know, amping up police presence.
Right. Wow, your answers are just they're great. I've had these conversations with really great people like you, and like many of the answers are like, you know, around the same like kind of ideology. Especially like Lori and I, when we look, you know, Lori, she teaches in the social equity, she's taught in social equity, and like even when I'm home or just talk with people about cannabis, and you're spot on, like everyone's not as passionate about it. Some people just don't care enough, even though they might have smoked weed for, you know, 15, 20 X amount of years, they might not just care enough to like say, hey, you know what I mean? Like, I like what you're doing, it's cool, but like, you know. So I think how that relates to restorative justice is it's not about cannabis, as you said. It's about other opportunities as well. So that was a great answer. Maybe we shouldn't take money from the police and put it towards cannabis. Oh, that's great. So now we're gonna go to the speed questions. These are a little less weighty, a little less weighty, and a little bit more cultural to your experience. So, is that cool with you?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. And actually, I'm gonna ask you one more question, because you have a good feel on like, you know, what's going on around in other states, especially as you talked about New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island. So in this program, and actually another class that I taught, I had a chief of police in my class. I had people that work for the state legislature here in Massachusetts, you know, municipal leaders. So think about the municipalities in Massachusetts that might have moratoriums. Think about other states and other cities. Like what framework or one piece of advice would you give to municipal leaders if they're looking or at some point potentially coming on board with legal cannabis, legal sales in cannabis?
I would tell them to look closely at what's happening locally. I think oftentimes like people try to look at other states, which is okay, but really they need to look at what's happening like around them, you know, because we saw this a lot, like people in Massachusetts, they were like oh, it's going to be like Colorado. And there's no, like, just look at the law. Like, it's much different. You can't have all these different things. So it's just like educate yourself, right? It's not that hard. Like, educate yourself into, and don't get caught up in the hysteria, right? On both sides, and make reasonable decisions, right? Like, we're not asking for anything, that isn't based in fact, based in sound policy. You know what I mean? Like, when you actually just strip it down and look at what we're talking about, it doesn't, it makes a lot of sense. And it's not anything that's really difficult, but the cannabis laws are very regional specific, right? So you cannot look at another state and just transpose what has happened there into what's happening in your, place. And so I think you just need to be aware. And then also I only want to give advice to folks that are for cannabis, right? Because the other people, they just need to be educated. But for the folks that on the municipal level, you have to come with your facts, and you also have to come with support, right? Because I don't know if people have ever been at the municipal level. It's like a zoo, right? It's like high school and like a zoo mixed together, right? The people with the loudest opinions often win, and scare tactics often win. And so coming with real information that combats, right? And often that's just like the law, to be like, actually, no, it says here that that's not allowed, right? What we saw is a lot of, there's going to be neon signs and all this other stuff. And it's like, no, like literally that is specifically, forbidden, so if you can come and you can show and you can actually have something that people can take home and think about, I would say that's really helpful, because there's a lot of, like I said, hysteria is probably the way that I best describe like municipal conversations around cannabis. Right. And it could be a lot better. And it often just takes somebody coming with like, a factoid to calm everybody down.
Right. That's great. Look locally. I love that.
Yeah.
Honestly. All right. Well, great answer there. So let's get into some cultural questions. Your favorite marijuana documentary or movie?
So I definitely am kind of old school with like the Cheech and Chong Up in Smoke, Okay. Like I remember watching that in high school. And then the other day I was also watching Pineapple Express, which was way funnier than I remembered watching it the first time. So I definitely, I consume cannabis, so I am into the stoner movies. I think they're really funny, and those are a couple of my. I don't like have favorites of things, but those are definitely too high on my list.
And you mentioned the Cheech and Chong, like when did that come? I've never seen
Up in Smoke. Okay, so that came out in like the 70s, I think.
That's great.
And I remember watching that in high school. Like, being kind of, out on like a little vacation with some of my friends and watching Up in Smoke and thinking about what am I going to do with my life, And so that's always a good one. And you know what I think is really funny? It has been really funny now to like, meet Cheech and Chong and see them in the cannabis industry and see them grow as like entrepreneurs and be these older guys that are like in great health. Right. And we're totally just like the slacker stoner dudes. It's very, very appropriate, I would say, for cannabis, which is people just assuming you're funny and you're just this joke, but then you're actually like doing good things in the background. And so I think that is that always makes me smile when I kind of see these interesting. The cannabis industry is very funny, the people you start to see that get involved in this industry really make you laugh and smile. I saw something yesterday about Paragon, this scam. There's so many different scams in the cannabis industry, but it was like a Bitcoin for cannabis, and then they were talking about how like the game was one of the investors, and I was like,
I know what you're talking about.
What? It's just so funny when you just like see random stuff pop up of like who's involved in this industry. It's funny.
Well, yeah. I mean, what makes it interesting is that for a while, it's always kind of like I like to see that one side of the industry is gimmicks, right? Yep. And the other side is super weighty stuff that we're talking about. You know what I mean? So it's like balancing between that like ultra gimmicky things and then like, what's really, really things are about, Yeah. So I feel like you got a good balance on that, though.
Yeah, I think I do. I would say I feel like I'm very much part of the cannabis culture, but also kind of
Right.
part of the new world of cannabis business, you know, and like I said, I really enjoy it.
No, that's dope. That's dope. So what about music? What kind of music you into? Musicians?
Oh man, so I love a variety and I listen to music all day, but I kind of switch it up, right? So I have my traditional like R&B type station. So Sade is like my favorite. That's like my go-to when I'm trying to like chill and wind down. But I also listen to a lot of international music. So I listen to a lot of like African funk music.
Okay.
It all depends on like what mode I'm in. So I have to change modes a lot during the day, right? Like sometimes I'm in my like, you know, getting all my, you know, operational stuff done, right? That's when I usually like will turn on some like hip hop, like some, you know, some whatever, you know, just top hits of the day. And then, but when I'm in my like development mode, I need like my international music, stuff that has a little bit, stuff that maybe isn't even a language that I can't even understand the words, you know what I mean? And I'm just like able to feel the vibe and it gets me like in my creative zone. Yeah, so those are usually, I have all my different Pandora stations and I just like flesh through them throughout the day. And I even have my little like, I have my like beach music too. I got to get into my different modes. And then I also listen to a lot of covers, right? Like 80s covers.
Okay. Like rock music?
Yeah. And so they'll get like some of them even have like a chill, like beach vibe or like a reggae cover of like an 80s song. So yeah, keep it.
Have you ever dabbled in making music yourself?
No. I am not a musician. I will tell you, if there was one skill that I wish I had, I wish I could sing. And I can't at all. So no, I leave that to the professionals and I make my own music through my products.
No, that's great. Well, yeah, you're doing the right thing. So don't sweat it if you don't have that skill.
You can't have everything, right?
Oh, seriously. I mean, I at some point in my life thought I wanted to be a rapper. So here we are. Oh, so what about books though? What about books? What are you reading now? What's helped you navigate your career?
So it's so funny because I will say that going to law school, right? You have to read so much every single night. I'm talking about just cases and treatises and all this other stuff. So after law school, I would definitely say that I've kept my reading pretty varied and pretty light. I would say I'm not, you know, if you're talking about personality types, right? I don't ascribe to all of that, but if you go by like INTP or the thing, I'm definitely that P, right? And the P at the end, you're the P or a J. A J is like a judgmental, like, right? You like, you know, you know how you like things and you stick with that. Right. The P is possibilities, right? So I'm that P person that's like, I like all the different stuff and I love a good sample. So for me, a lot of the books that I read are kind of those like top sellers that people talk about. Like, for example, like 48 Laws of Power or 4-Hour Work Week and things like that. And I don't read them in the religious sense, meaning that a lot of people read those books and then they like that becomes their religion, you know what I mean? But I read those books to try to, because I feel like when people are writing, like, and then I do this often, I look at successful people and then I look at either their inspirational quotes or I'll read their book or whatever. And it's really to just like glean what angle they were able to take in their life that led to success, right? And looking at the parallels and maybe what I see or what I see in other people's lives and kind of trying to take that back. So that's what I mean by kind of like those books, like 48 Laws of Power. There's some interesting nuggets in any kind of book or corpus that somebody has put together to say like this is the way that you should like approach your life, you know. And I think that there are interesting and funny things to find in there. And so and you know, sometimes that success is money, right? Like looking at people just who have been incredibly successful in business and looking at their stuff. But then other folks, it is, you know, just that they have been very successful in what they've been able to give to humanity in life and trying to find that right blend there, you know, in my search for my ultimate purpose and, you know, what I'm trying to accomplish.
That's great. That's great. Well, if you ever come out with a book, I'm definitely reading it. So. So what about, I know you talked about high school a little bit, you know, smoking weed in high school. How old were you when you first interacted with marijuana and where were you?
Yeah, so I was 17, and I really was from the Dare generation, so I was like pretty anti-cannabis. Like I didn't, um, I wasn't really down for it. But I remember I was not feeling well. I was really upset emotionally. I remember I was like in a big fight with, I don't know, my parents or somebody. And I remember some of my friends were smoking. They rolled a blunt and they were smoking. And I was like, you know what? Fine. And I went and I smoked, and I remember when I laid down, all my pain was gone.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And this was a different cyst that I had at that time. And I was like, that's crazy. And I was like, that wasn't so bad, you know? And then that's definitely where I started. And I wasn't like consuming cannabis like daily, like I am now then. When I was younger, that started more once I, got a little bit older and was using it for medical purposes. But it definitely, it was one of the first things where I was like, maybe I've been wrong about some other things too. You know what I mean? Because, what you're told about something isn't always accurate. And that definitely was the case for cannabis.
That's amazing. It's crazy because the other people that I interview are kind of on that same path where like they were introduced at a teenage year, but then like, it's not like daily consumption as a teenager. It's like, oh, okay, I know what I understand now. And then like, you get older and it's like, all right, I can implement this into my daily regimen, almost like eating healthy, so to speak, So,
yeah, it definitely affected me more when I was younger. Like I definitely have built up a tolerance to cannabis. Like when I first was taking it, it definitely was more overwhelming.
Right.
And again, I think that's why I didn't consume as much. And then I also started learning different ways to consume and started using that and tailoring that to my lifestyle. And I also started getting way more stress, right? I graduated high school. I was in college. I had a baby. I'm doing all this stuff. It was a lot, you know what I mean? And cannabis definitely kept me centered through all that. And I was able to go, did great in college, went to law school, did that. And now looking back, I have this 20-year-old son and all of this stuff. And it's like, people are like, wow, how'd you do all that? And I'm just like, yeah, it was really hard. But, having this tool that was able to improve my health and then also, make me feel better when I'm stressed out and make me focused when I'm feeling, frazzled, that definitely, was a huge part of my success.
Yeah. I didn't realize you had a son while you were in college.
Yeah, I had my son after freshman year of college.
Wow.
So that was very, that was a scary time, and there was a lot of responsibility all of a sudden on me. You know what I mean? To get my stuff together. I was 19 when I had my son, so that was definitely a huge focus and changed the trajectory of my life. Definitely made me more focused. You know what I mean? To make sure that I was getting all my stuff done.
You went to UPenn, right, for undergrad?
Yeah, I went to UPenn undergrad, and then I went to Northeastern for law school.
Shout out to Huskies. Yeah, I went to business school.
Yeah.
And where are you from originally? Are you from Massachusetts?
Yeah. So I was born in Dorchester. That's where my family's from. And my dad's from North Carolina, but he moved up to Dorchester. And then my mother, that's where she's from. And then I moved out to Stoughton. And that's where I went to like elementary school and high school, Stoughton Sharon area. And then I went to Penn and then moved back here. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Massachusetts through and through. And I love it here. And again, I think that's also, I think, what made it, important for me to pursue cannabis policy here. Like, this is where I live. I mean, this is, right. I mean, like, I'm like, the crack epidemic hit my family really hard in the 80s. You know what I mean? So like, that is all the things that I remember, right? Like, what kind of happened to the places that we love, and and it's not just that, it's that, and just over enforcement generally, and seeing the impact on me, on my family, on all the people that I care about and love. Definitely I'm proud to do anything that I can in Massachusetts. Obviously it's not perfect, but I think it's at least a good example too for what you need to do to fight and what people can do to make it better in other states too.
Absolutely. So how about just on the topic of family, how do they perceive, and you're well on into your career now, obviously, but like how, maybe in the beginning, early on, how do they perceive?
I think they were always supportive. I think my parents were like, when they realized I smoked when I was younger, they were just like worried a little bit, but they never like punished me for it. And I think it's because both of them used cannabis when they were younger. And so I think that was good. And then obviously once I started the business, it was all support, and that's a great thing. Like, I have a really supportive family. My mother was my first investor, and so definitely having them believe in me and tell me, like, you're smart, you're good, you can do it. I mean, that is the key to my success. You know what I mean? Having support and people telling you that, yes, you are good, you can do good things, like that definitely, love my family.
That's amazing. So what, you're a consumer, you're with the culture. What's your favorite? What's your go-to strain, variety?
Okay, so I'm definitely a sativa leaning, and of course there's arguments. Sativa, indica, is that even a thing? Well, it is a thing when it comes down to kind of the terpene profiles that are with each of those. And so I am definitely a very light, fruity type of consumer. I really, really, really love, the citrus terpene and bud that has like a very flowery fragrance. So some of my favorites. What am I smoking now? Cindy 99. So it's a cross of like Cinderella and like Blue Dream, I believe. I love purple flavored. So like purple punch, any naturally purple strain. That's just an aesthetic thing in addition to it like tasting really great. I really love the berry undertones as well. I smoke joints. I make suppositories. I make edibles. I do everything. I use my face to keep my complexion nice and clear. So I'm basically dipped in cannabis.
Yeah. Wow. Shanel, wow, it's just awesome to have you.
Yay, this is so great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
An inventor, an entrepreneur, a mother, a lawyer, all these things, an advocate, all these things kind of rolled up into cannabis and really representing for the underrepresented. And it's a very unique situation, and I'm really grateful to have spoken with Shanel on the topics that we discussed. And yeah, as I had mentioned, just admire the work that she's done and that she will continue to do. So from ballot initiatives to initiative at the legislative level, and this is just not regarding cannabis in general. It's basically how laws are written and regulated, and we see that, and she, makes it digestible for us to understand. So just a lot of appreciation, and I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation.